the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writers group. I'm Anton.
I'm Jane.
I'm Chris.
I'm Kate.
I'm Chelsea.
And I'm Carter.
Welcome back, Kate. Thank you for sticking around.
Happy to be here, guys.
So today we're talking about villains. This has been, we're very excited about this one. I think it's safe to say, right?
A lot of internet chat.
This is going to be great.
We've already had arguments, fistfights.
Exactly. Yeah, we're barely into this. So we need to kick off with definitions, because I think villains is a broad, if you just say villain, what does it really mean? So who wants to start?
I'll start.
Chelsea.
I tend to categorize villains as a villain is kind of bigger than an antagonist. And so an antagonist is going to oppose the protagonist at a more individual level. So to me, a villain opposes the values of the world that the book is set in. So, on many different levels.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that lots of villains oppose the values of the world, like supervillains, for example. But I also, sometimes the world itself is messed up. And sometimes the villain in that case is actually upholding the values of the world. So for me, I feel like a villain is someone who opposes the values of the reader, right? Or the values that the reader is told should be their values.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I guess I kind of think of the antagonist as being more of like a story structure thing, or a functional thing, where they're basically there to introduce and drive the conflict that the protagonist is dealing with. And that person who does that can be villainous or even heroic if the protagonist is an anti-hero or a villain. But when I think of what an actual villain is, I kind of think that usually a villain is in some way evil.
Yeah.
However the reader might think of evil, or at least a villain is someone who, even if they think they're doing the right thing in some way, or if they don't, they're inflicting some kind of malice or kind of antipathic sense on everything around them, or at least on the protagonist. I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah,
I mean, antagonists. So I like what you said about how antagonists are a story function, because I think that's how they drive the story forward, they drive conflict forward, they oppose the protagonist. But in romance, for example, which I read a lot of romance too. Maybe I may have mentioned this before.
Once or twice.
But the antagonist is often the love interest, because they are the ones that most oppose the protagonist.
Yeah, and then you have a problem on your hands if your romance antagonist is also the villain.
Yeah, you don't want that.
But if you if you think of it as a spectrum, Jane, if you think of it, if you move further out, I think the villain is someone or something that is bigger than an antagonist. It's something, and Chris, you brought this up before we got on mic, which is the villain can be existential. The villain can be something so big that it's not even a character.
Yeah, so obviously the big example of that is Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Right. Did I pronounce that right, Chelsea?
Yeah, you pronounced it right. Sauron.
I don't want to step on any toes.
So yeah, to me, I think of Sauron as, the number one fantasy villain. And to me, the reason that Sauron is the number one fantasy villain, let me get out my list.
Oh boy.
Oh, there's a list.
Is because Sauron is a rejection of all of the values of the world and the values of the hero. If you know about the Tolkien Legendarium, the world comes into being through the Song of Iluvatar. And
the what?
Oh, the what?
So hold on.
Don't go there.
The world, Middle Earth, is sung into existence by God. And Melkor, aka Morgoth, is...
Oh boy.
Look, which Chelsea posts
Professor
endless
Tom's
memes about.
Look, there are a lot of good memes out there.
We only have so much time here.
All right. So Morgoth introduces a disharmony or a discord to the music of the Ainur, or the music of Iluvatar, and Sauron is a product of that disharmony, and so Sauron comes into being as being contrary to the values of the world. He also, he wants absolute power. One of the themes in The Lord of the Rings is the corrupting nature of power, and absolute power in particular. And Sauron, through his ring, overthrows people's free will. He gets people, like the influence of evil and power, gets people to reject the song and being open to the possibilities of
Well, let me just stop you right there because I don't disagree with you, but I would say that Sauron is more the embodiment of evil than the actual villain in
Yeah.
the story. So you say he bends people's will with the rings, but he actually doesn't. He created a ring and then he stands back and lets the world sort of go
and
like clockwork.
And I do think that's kind of a problem with that character because he's not really
not a
present.
character.
He's
Well,
like you
so
said, he's an existential threat.
He's there all the time, but most of the tension, the conflict in the story is from other characters who I would consider the villains. And I know this is an unpopular thing to say.
You're going to say it, aren't you?
To me, the main villain of The Lord of the Rings is Gollum.
That's crazy.
He
Yeah,
is the
I
one that
disagree.
comes
Well, he
into
does create the
constant
most
conflict with Frodo.
Smeagol
and the
did nothing wrong.
Smeagol is not
he
Gollum.
is, he
That's
is
a whole
for
different
sure
thing.
an antagonist.
He's
For
definitely an
sure.
antagonist.
He's an antagonist.
So he also causes. He is the fulcrum around which the story turns. I think he's more than an antagonist. I think he's more
think that's a
important.
good
There's
point.
lots of antagonists and villains in the
But
story.
his intention isn't to do harm. His intention is to get something that will help himself, and the harm is kind of incidental. It's not something that
He just wants his
pushing
precious.
for.
Yeah, he wants
His
the ring
sweet,
back.
sweet
Whereas I think a lot of
precious.
villains are their intention is to they're intentionally creating actions that cause harm to the hero or the side that as a reader we're supposed to be rooting
sure,
for.
Yeah,
But-
and even though Sauron isn't immediately apparent, the ring wraiths are there. Saruman is there, and so there's a lot of antagonistic force coming out of Sauron.
Right, but again, if we're talking about villains as characters, Sauron is really a force of nature. So as you step back, I can see the argument for making it for Gollum. I think you can even, as you keep coming back and you start to see villains as a character. So the example that I brought was the man with the thistledown hair from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And the man with the thistledown hair is the villain, and again, like not existential in the way that Sauron is, but an actual character, like has an actual person, is a physical form, but is chaotic. We don't know what his intentions are, so it's he's opposing the characters, he's opposing the story, but we don't know what his end is. So he's just there to sort of make mischief and to sort of destroy things.
Yeah. Well, and his values contradict
Exactly. Yeah.
everybody around him, so he's just being himself.
But we don't know to what end.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying but he's, again, it's like two steps down from Sauron in that sense.
And I think, because he's Fae, I think for me, there's also the suggestion that the Fae operate on a whole other set of rules that are different from humans. Like they have their
morally.
own world. Yeah, morally different, because the Fae, also the man with the thistledown hair, it's all about bargains
Right.
and contracts, right? But the contracts are kind of tricks on humans because the humans can't quite understand what the deal is. So one of the things I love about the man with the thistledown hair as a villain is that, yes, he's chaotic and unpredictable, but you also get the sense that there's this whole world of the Fae that you're just getting a tiny glimpse of through his actions.
Yeah, exactly. And he's coming into this world, and so there's sort of what are the limitations, or what are his strengths, or what powers does he bring, or something like that, which I think then again makes him more real to the reader, if that makes sense.
He's also really selfish, because I think a lot of what he does is driven by his desire to possess. And in this case, it's to possess other human souls and take them back to his world. So I think selfishness is often a key characteristic of a villain.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think I kind of differentiate two kinds of villains in my head. There's like villains, and there's like anti-villains, or what people call sympathetic villains a lot. So there's like the villains that truly mean to do harm, or they only care about themselves, or they just want to watch the world burn, that kind of thing. And then there's villains who, in their head, aren't really doing anything wrong, or at least to them, their goals are good, and they're not setting out to do evil just for the sake of cackling about it. They actually they
have an agenda.
Yeah, they think that they have a justifiable, reason for doing what they do. And to me, those are the villains that better reflect reality and stuff. So I usually enjoy reading those more than like a Sauron or a Thistledown here, as much as I do love
That's
Sauron.
actually a great segue to my example that I brought in, because the villains that I want to talk about think they are upholding the law and that they're on the side of order and right and good, and they're just trying to help people. But they're totally villains.
They're wrong.
They're totally wrong. Yes. The reader's values completely clash with theirs. So my example is from Justina Ireland's novel, Dread Nation, which is set just after the Civil War, but in an alternate timeline where the Civil War dead rise as zombies. So good.
If it's after Civil War, there's a lot of them too.
There's a lot. It's kind of a big problem. And the way that society, the way that, the United States deals with this is that they conscript, so they free the slaves, sort of, because then the slaves are now conscripted to battle the zombies, and that's sort of the premise.
I have to read this book.
It's so good.
That's a very good news,
So
bad
good.
news kind of.
Yeah. Congratulations, you're free. But hey, go fight these zombies for us. And my example are two. There's the sheriff of this town and the pastor of this town. And the pastor is, he's a man of God and he's trying to do the right thing, but he is also straight up evil. And the way that he does what he considers the right thing is to remind former slaves of their place, right? And he'll say things like, what is it? Spare the rod and spoil the child, and like discipline is super important. And it's all to try to maintain order in a very, very chaotic time.
Well, and using spirituality as a weapon is, I think, really effective, because you're asking people to question their own morals and question their worth. And so that can be very insidious.
And that's very true to reality too. I mean, there's so many different ways throughout history that people have used religion to control people and to, keep oppressed people oppressed. And it's really interesting to be able to represent that in a fantasy universe and still have it be chillingly accurate like that.
Yeah. And now you're getting into villains as characters. So now they have motivation.
Yeah.
Now they have some kind of arc. Now they have some kind of purpose, or not purpose, but drive.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another good example of that is Mrs. Coulter from Philip Pullman's Golden Compass series, who is a very well-rounded character. You hear her motivations, you see where she's coming from. She's representing the church, and because of the perspective that we're coming into, and again, the reader's morality and point of view and values, she's standing opposed to that, but you can see how within her world she fully believes that everything that she's doing is for a purpose and is being in service of something. In her book, she is the hero of her story. And I think that really plays into what Carter was talking about and makes for a compelling villain, and whether it's in book form or TV or movies or what have you.
She's also very you like her at first.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like, wow, who is it? And obviously
she's so charismatic, and she's sitting there and she's offering the protagonist Lyra everything that she could possibly want. She's offering her a place, she's offering her a way to belong, and then it kind of gets pulled out from underneath her when she realizes just how terrible this whole situation is.
And she's a perversion of motherhood as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, one of my favorite scenes is when she really starts to show her true colors, when Lyra is living with her in her apartment and she flips and she starts to become very controlling and
locks her in the room.
She locks her up, and it's like that moment where you're like, oh, this woman is not what she appeared. She's really bad news, even though she thinks she's doing it for Lyra's own good or whatever,
or at least she tells herself she is.
She tells herself she is. Yeah.
I love appealing villains. I love when villains are glamorous and enticing. Like Mrs. Coulter is totally glamorous and enticing.
And I think Lord Asriel is too. I think the Golden Compass has a lot of those characters that sort of walk that edge within the framework of the narrative and the protagonists that we're rooting for and the values that we're set up to have. They're more on the villain bad guy side of the spectrum, but there's also just that dynamism to it.
Well, and again, I think that probably really hits home for a lot of readers because it happens in real life all the time. How many charismatic leaders have turned out to be genocidal maniacs throughout history. It's
Absolutely.
like
How
way
many
too
how many parental figures have let you down?
Oh, now the episode's
Wait, this
getting
isn't
fun.
about me.
Yeah, don't even get me started on the church thing. But
So let's talk a little bit about anti-heroes and what does that mean, and how do we situate an anti-hero versus a villain versus an antagonist?
So to me, like an anti-hero is somebody who is pro-tagging but evilly. And so like their end goal might be good. The end goal might be save the orphanage, but the way that they're going to get there is, all right, save the orphanage. I'm going to poison the well in the Citadel, kill all the soldiers, and then the orphanage will be saved.
So yeah, and I don't think an anti-hero is necessarily the villain, and I think, and certainly in a lot of contemporary fiction, I don't think the anti-hero is a villain. I think
No.
I think they're
I think by definition, it's not.
Yeah, they're protagonists.
right, and so I think their means are terrible, but their goal is worthy, and so that hence the anti-hero.
yeah, and I don't think their means necessarily have to be terrible. I think it's just that they lack those traditional heroic qualities. Like they don't necessarily have a sense of justice, and they don't
Chivalry
necessarily
or-
care about the
Exactly.
law.
Honor.
Yeah. They can and they can be very selfish too.
Absolutely.
Exactly. On the D&D spectrum, they're the chaotic good.
Right.
You know,
Or
the ones
chaotic
that
That's
are
what I always play in D&D.
Well, it's everybody's
Shocking.
favorite.
Well,
Yeah,
Not
you can do
mine.
whatever you want.
there's
yeah.
lots of also like anti-heroes, like you take something like Altered Carbon or something where the hero is also ultra violent and has no problem like ripping people's heads off if it furthers their own ends. And to us, as to go back to full circle to what Jane said at the beginning about the villain sort of representing the opposite of the reader's moral like compass, like the guy in Altered Carbon, whose name escapes me right now, he's a homicidal psychopath. Like he's still the hero, but he's an anti-hero in the sense because he's like, no, but we don't agree with his.
Yeah, if he
his-
wasn't
his
set up as
actions.
the protagonist, you wouldn't be rooting for him. But because
Exactly.
he is set up as the protagonist and he's your way into this world and this story, he's quote unquote the good guy. He's the one that your heart is with, your emotions are with, even if you don't necessarily agree with all of his actions or want to see him taking these. It's the kind of like, oh no, please don't do this. I know you're going to do this, but why do you have to do it that way? I want you to be better than this kind of feeling.
So that really does bring in this idea of the villain. If the villain is against the world or the villain is against the reader's value, then the anti-hero is bringing in some flavor of that.
Yeah.
It's not full
Yeah.
flavor. It's not the whole thing, but it's a touch of that so that to your point, Kate, you sort of cringe and you're like, oh no, they're going to go, as Chelsea said, oh no, they're going to go poison the well. That's a terrible idea, but I
That's a
see what
terrible
you're
idea,
doing.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, all right, you're going to save the orphanage, but
geez.
God, at what
Yeah.
cost?
Exactly.
How much blood?
The character's name is Takeshi, by the way.
Thank
I
you,
looked it up.
And
And the
Well
author's
done.
Richard K. Morgan. Of
There
all
we
Thank
go.
you.
Just doing my due diligence over
You're the
here.
best.
But yeah, no, I think that's really interesting what Anton said. I think about it as a spectrum. You go like you can look at it in terms of
I think of it
D&D.
as a spectrum too.
We both think of it as a spectrum, and you can look at it in terms of D&D alignment, which I think is a good way to kind of apportion it. But it sort of goes from you have heroes that are heroes and embody all of these like very long-standing traditional hero tropes.
The paladins.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
The lawful
yeah,
good
the lawful
kind
good.
of.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have
Or what
like
Kate calls lawful stupid.
lawful
Or
stupid.
lawful boring.
Yeah. And then you have like anti-heroes, and then that can kind of segue into straight up gray characters like, everybody in George R. R. Martin's universe.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
there's
A true
sympathetic
neutral.
villains, and then there's like pure villains,
Well,
psychopaths.
yeah, because there's like nothing about having a lawful or a good character, quote unquote character alignment is going to keep you from being an antagonist.
Absolutely.
Donald in a lot of the Dresden books, he antagonists very, very hard because he's in direct opposition to everything Harry Dresden stands for. Harry Dresden is a font of chaos, and all Donald is trying to do is to keep him from starting more fires. And like he just wants to see this idiot wizard brought to justice
Yeah,
so
and
bad.
he has this code that he follows in
Yeah.
very strict ways.
Yeah, and like it's and then what Butcher has to do is he has to associate our values with Harry. So we have to know over and over and over again that what Harry is doing is right. Even though, like, I think in some of the later books, Harry does some really questionable, fucked up things.
Well,
and
he starts to move into anti-hero territory.
and he becomes the villain for a lot of people, or like for different perspectives within the universe. But it like has it actually fallen out of vogue to write a pure villain?
Well, I have an example from my own writing.
Oh, okay.
Who is pretty irredeemable. So this is from The Runner, which is my book.
The book that got you an
The
agent.
book that got me an agent.
It's my favorite. It's my favorite
Let's
book.
just say
By
it.
the way,
So I'm just going to read a quick scene. So the villain in question is named Plotch, and he is fairly irredeemable, even though he is not all he seems now. But in the scene, there are three characters. There's Plotch, there's his underling Buckland, who he is bullying into a kidnapping, and there's a little orphan boy named Lamb in the corner. Plotch blew a last plume of smoke in Buckland's direction, stubbed out his cigarette on the table, leaving behind a charred black spot, and flicked the butt into a corner with a long bony finger. You'll be taking them. You can go get the waitress. Earn your goddamn keep and learn not to question me. No, I can't go. I can't kidnap someone. Plotch ignored him. He was staring at Lamb over in the corner, the boy oblivious to the two of them, still picking at the scab on his leg. Plotch left the table and quickly, silently crept his way across the room. He knelt down beside the boy, who flinched in surprise. Plotch, Buckland began, but Plotch cut him off with an angry hiss. He reached out and poked the scab with one long yellow finger, and the boy flinched again, harder. Plotch grabbed Lamb's leg to hold him steady as the boy shoved and lashed out with his skinny arms, and with a sudden motion, he dug a fingernail below the edge of the scab and tore it off. Lamb yelped, and Plotch walked slowly back behind the table and sat, rolling his prize between his index finger and his thumb. Go to mass, he said, continuing to examine the scab. Have your breakfast, stuff your face, then set it up. Go grab her tonight and bring her back, right here, to me. So
Very villainous.
So this is the moment. This is sort of, for me, this was my Mrs. Coulter moment, where he's been bullying everybody up until now, but this is the moment where I'm like, this is an irredeemable guy. He's going to pick on this orphan boy and pick a scab off, and he's disgusting, and he's fucked up.
for no other reason than he's just annoyed by it, right? Or something.
He's annoyed by it, and
it's a power thing.
It's a power thing.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
exerting control.
Yeah, he's
Right.
pushing everybody around, and he does that throughout the book.
I really like that passage, and I really liked Plotch in general when I beta read this. I think you do two things to characterize him really well here. One is just like the action and like the way, like you really challenge the reader to consider why anyone would do something like
Yeah.
this. And it's like, oh, obviously this guy's fucked up, you know, and that's really cool to kind of like keep him interesting and like, you know, make you like really want to figure out why, but also like have this sort of grotesque action going on. I also thought the language that you use subtly really helps the whole, you know, irredeemable villain characterization. You have him like, you say he crept across the room,
Right,
and
his
has a
bony
long
finger.
yellow finger, and
Yeah.
he rolls his prize between his fingers, and it's
Yeah.
like,
Details.
it's all very dark and like very creepy, and like kind of like, you know, sets your hair up while you're reading it.
Yeah.
So it's like,
I want him to be creepy. I want him to make you go, ew, I don't want to be in the room with
yeah,
him.
good job.
Definitely
Yeah,
leaves
you
a
did
lasting
it.
impression.
Yeah. And
I don't want to
also-
be in the room with you.
I think there's also a really, I don't know if it's an ironic contrast with his name, because Plotch sounds to me almost comical. Like it
Right.
could be like a comic sidekick, but then he's actually really chilling. And I
Yeah.
thought that was a fun sort of subversion of our expectations.
Yeah, but so he's an example of what I would consider an irredeemable villain.
Yeah.
He does have motivations, and he does have a slight arc, but he's just
bad.
He's just
He's
a bad
never going to
guy.
become a
Evil.
good guy.
And I
Yeah.
think it's,
Bad
you know,
dude.
it's totally fine to write those kinds of characters, especially if you can keep it interesting. I
Yeah.
feel like, you know, there's a lot of maybe pressure, maybe even subconscious pressure lately in the genre fiction world to write gray characters and to try to make everyone as hyper realistic as you can.
Sure.
But I also think that there's, you know, definitely still a place to swing on both sides of the spectrum. And as long as you can make it
Absolutely.
work, then it works and it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, fiction overall is about just exploring our own experience, and you know, a lot of people are gray and a lot of people are, you know, human and have motivations. And then sometimes you like, I think psychologically, you just have to start assigning blame at some point.
Yeah.
And that's where, like, that's where villains come in. And,
Totally.
you know, you have to have a way of explaining the darkness in the night, you know, and the thing that's caused all of the horrors in the world, because surely it couldn't be a human being just like you who would do such a thing.
Yeah.
But I would say that that's what makes villains scarier, is when they are kind of a human being just like us.
Or I would say, even if you go even further out, I think they're scary when they really can destroy the world or own the world, or really, the scariest villains to me are the ones that are all powerful. The hero has
Sauron?
That's a
Like
great
Sauron,
example.
yeah.
The hero has no way of overcoming them. And so you're reading the story going, it's never going to work. This is never going to work. This is never going to work.
I don't disagree with you, but I would argue that it doesn't have to be an existential danger to the whole world. If I'm reading a book and I'm invested in a character, if that character's personal life, if their personal world is going to get destroyed, I feel like that's just as powerful, if not more powerful. to
Yeah,
me.
if
Yeah.
not more
Yeah.
so.
Yeah,
it's
I like
so
that
specific.
too. Because I think I've gotten kind of like world-ending fatigue with reading a little bit, because it's hard to read book after book where it's like, oh my god, the whole world is going to end if blank happens. And so yeah, it's very important, I think, to have a lot of variety. And I think we've gotten a lot of that now, because writing the human villain has become such a big.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of those things where, like, you know, we started this talking about Lord of the Rings, which we've talked about in the past and have mentioned is very old, right? You know, and so it doesn't mean it's not great, but as you know, we've worked our way through the 30s and 40s and then to postmodernism, et cetera, and literature, like fantasy and speculative fiction have also made that same journey, and I think that our villains a lot of the time are more humanized now.
Yeah, but without losing sight of what the genres were originally created and have always done, which is have that commentary on what is going on today and sort of the bigger picture elements too. I mean, Jane, your examples were a great example. Sorry for that bad sentence structure of the ways that villains can stand in for the greater ills of society. And I think that that's something that fantasy and science fiction particularly do very, very well, is give us a way to talk about things that are scary and horrifying and strike you down at your core in a way that is more accessible. And
Yeah. Like adding dragons to the Nazis. Like, the Nazis were bad, but if they have dragons now, it's like, oh shit, they're really bad.
Yeah.
And it kicks it up a notch.
That's no good.
Yeah.
That's
No,
not
nobody wants Nazis with dragons.
No.
I would read that.
Yeah. I would too. It's like Naomi Novik.
Exactly.
She could write a whole other series. But yeah, and for me, villains are so important because I actually don't enjoy stories that don't have like humanoid villains. Like, I really don't find man versus nature stories that compelling. For me, and this is just my personal preference, I need to know that there is out there an intelligence that is working against the protagonist. And I find that incredibly compelling.
Well, and I even like when there's an internal antagonist. So like man versus nature, like, but it's really man versus their own shortcomings, man versus whatever physical problems they have going on. Like, that's way more interesting. And you become your own villain.
I like both of those ideas a lot, but I would say, not to disagree with what you were saying, Jane, but I do really enjoy stories where there's almost this kind of Kafka-esque feeling of like forces beyond the protagonist's comprehension, or machines in the system that are working against the protagonist, and they don't even understand why. Like, there is something very scary about, and very villainous about, the idea of there being systems and institutional structures that are designed to work against people.
Yeah,
and a lot of times, you know, like the example of Dread Nation, that sounds really interesting because it sounds like in a lot of ways the antagonist is really the power structures. And like, obviously there's real people implementing these, you know, oppressive religions and white supremacy and things like that, but there's also like the fact of those things themselves is in many ways a villain, like kind of like how Sauron is this bigger background force that kind of spreads his villainous tendrils a bunch of ways, and that like there's like a super realistic horror there that I think really works for writing villains.
If AP was here, he would definitely be bringing up what's his name right now?
Lovecraft.
Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Shout out AP.
You did say tendrils.
Tendril. Yeah, you did say tendrils.
Speaking of white
Are
supremacy,
they eldritch tendrils?
Oh, that's the best kind. That's funny. We haven't even talked about that, but that is a very existential threat, right? Because, somebody like Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth, like those aren't characters, right? They're just,
right? They're forces.
they're forces
things.
of nature, right?
But then it drives the protagonist, it drives you insane, and then you become your own
which would be
inner antagonist.
Which would be my point to Carter, which is the machine being the villain. It's not until it's embodied in a character that it becomes viable in a story. It's not until the reader can actually see that machine sort of in motion, if you will, through characterization, that it becomes something that you can kind of understand or root against or whatever.
Right, and sorry to bring up Nazis again, but that's the whole argument behind the I was just following orders argument, right? And to me, that is incredibly chilling that ordinary people could do such evil, villainous things because they consider themselves part of the system and they don't want to defy it.
I can't see dragons doing that. That just seems to go against their nature.
I think zombies are a good example of that as well. The zombie itself is, it gets really tedious just reading about people going up against zombies and constantly every chapter, there's more zombies. It's when it starts to have an impact on the society and on the more realistic or more relatable elements that it starts to become more compelling.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Zombies are in this case.
They're a mechanism as opposed to the actual
Zombies
villain
aren't
or
evil,
the
aren't
conflict.
villains by themselves.
Yeah.
No, they're a forcing function that
Mm-hmm.
clarifies the ills of society.
So we've been talking about villains, and I'm glad that we defined zombies are not villains. I think we've really, that's a real breakthrough.
Zombies did not.
I think for a lot of people out there, they may not have known that.
They didn't start the fire.
Yeah. But this has been really interesting because we've been talking about villains and the difference between a villain and an antagonist, or a villain and an anti-hero. And I'm going to bring it back to what you said, Jane, because I think to me that's what resonates, is that villains are against the reader's values. If I'm writing a villain, how do I know if it's an anti-hero or an antagonist? And if the villain is against the reader's values, then I know I'm writing a villain. I'm writing somebody who is, and they may, become an antagonist, and you may be able to characterize them. But if you start there, then I think you can safely say you've started down the road of villainy.
I think that that's the key, is that that's a good place to start, is to find a character that really is morally reprehensible in some way, or like you said, doesn't agree with the norms of the reader. And that's a great place to start.
Or who represents things in the real world that are villainous and that are harmful and problematic.
Villains are against the world as well. Yeah.
I think that, I'm always, I say this all the time on the podcast, but I'm always a big advocate for the fantastic reflecting the realistic. So like for me, whenever, I think a big takeaway from what we've been talking about is, in a lot of ways, you want your villains to be realistic, even if their motivations aren't sympathetic. So if you can write a villain in a way that makes your readers, afraid or worried or concerned in the same way that they would be about something in the real world, then that's when you're starting to nail it.
That's the trick, yeah.
Yeah, when your reader can recognize the villain in some way. Yeah.
And is scared for the hero.
Or for themselves.
So let us know, who's your favorite villain. Have we talked about him? If your favorite villain is Sauron, then yes, we have.
We'll talk more about it, though, if you want.
I'll talk more about it.
I'm really going to have to read this Lord of the Rings book you keep talking about. It sounds really good.
Anton.
But let us know who your favorite villain is and why. What makes them a villain? Why do you love them? You can find us at Genre Hustle on Twitter, at Genre Hustle on Instagram. You can drop leaflets over Los Angeles. We're pretty well dispersed. We'll probably pick one up, right? That's
right.
good. We'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.